This video is brought to you by Hover. More on that later. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Today's video, the final episode of our series on the North African campaign in the Second World War. When we last left off, the Desert Fox was on the run. In November 1942, Erwin Rommel and his forces escaped capture at the hands of Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army. He was outgunned and outmatched, but not out of the fight. The last 2 months of the year would prove to be dramatic, as would the next. On November 8, 1942, more than 100,000 Allied troops landed at 3 points in Morocco and Algeria, arriving to the rear of Rommel's embattled Afrika Korps. The landing sites, Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, were themselves a compromise between two very different visions on the part of American and British planners. Winston Churchill's government had favored a more spread-out, large-scale deployment all over the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. Americans, on the other hand, were still concerned about the loyalties of the Vichy French forces in the area. Perhaps more significantly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Joint Chiefs feared the possibility that such a large movement in the Western Mediterranean would provoke a response from nationalist Spain, which had been nominally neutral so far, but had a strong affinity for the Axis powers. Ultimately, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower decided on a happy medium. Operation Torch included 3 prongs, which would reach into the Mediterranean, but only as far as Algiers. The Western Task Force was entirely made up of 30,000 American men and was led by George S. Patton in their landing at Casablanca. The Center Task Force was made up of 39,000 American ground troops, but with a British naval escort who landed in Oran, Algeria. Lastly, the Eastern Task Force, made up of 10,000 Americans and 23,000 British troops, was also protected by the British Navy on its way to Algiers. Altogether, the force involved in Operation Torch, called the British First Army, despite its heterogeneous makeup, was more than 100,000 strong and led by British General Kenneth Anderson. When they arrived on November 8th, the disposition of Vichy forces in the area was largely still a mystery. As military historian Brian Lane Herder explains, French officers' loyalty to the Vichy regime varied. The Nazis were generally disliked to despised, but seemingly non-stop British and American military disasters hardly inspired confidence in defying the Wehrmacht. Though the Allies were uncertain of Vichy France's allegiance, U.S. General Mark Clark met with Charles Mast, Resident General of France in Tunisia, before the invasion as part of an extended campaign of subterfuge designed to garner French support in North Africa. However, the secret of Clark offered scant on details of Operation Torch. Many of the French troops stationed in the area had no idea what was coming. When American and British troops set foot in French North Africa, the garrison forces were so confused and hesitant that they did not resist the landings. They did, however, put up stiff resistance at the cities of Casablanca and Oran. This miscommunication was almost fatal to the operation. Since they had not expected meaningful resistance, there had been no naval or aerial bombing in advance of the attack, and it looked like the Center and Western Task Forces were in trouble. Eastern Task Force, on the other hand, had little difficulty seizing Algiers, which they did the same day they landed. Charles Mast commanded the French in this sector and ordered his men to stand down with the tentative approval of his superior, Admiral François D'Erlon. The admiral, a notorious Nazi collaborator and deputy leader of the country, was an opportunist above all, and had hinted he would be willing to defect to the Allies. Seeing which way the winds were blowing, he ordered a ceasefire, first in Algiers and then in North Africa generally. With basically no authority to do so, D'Erlon negotiated a nominal cooperation agreement with the Allies on November 13th, called the Darlan Agreement, allowing for the use of civilian infrastructure as well as actual military support. Up north, Hitler stopped pretending to respect French sovereignty and invaded the Free Zone that had remained unoccupied after the fall of France in 1940. On November 9th, German reinforcements began flying in from their newly captured airfields into Tunisia. By the end of the month, the German soldiers in the country numbered 15,000, bolstered by another 9,000 Italians who arrived by road from Tripoli. Both Allied and Axis armies wanted to reach Tunis and fortify it first. Making the situation even more urgent was the coming Tunisian wet season. Heavy rains would likely mean impassable roads, and perhaps more than a month of safety for whoever occupied the capital city when they began. The war in Northwest Africa was a race against time. Logistical delays meant that Kenneth Anderson could only begin the offensive on November 25th, 1942. They advanced quickly along the coastal road, but were checked around Bizerte 10 days later by the 5th Panzer Army. Among the reinforcements the 5th Army had received were a handful of the cutting-edge Panzer VI Tiger tanks for field testing. When General Jürgen von Arnim arrived on December 9th to take control of all Axis forces in Tunisia, he had some of Nazi Germany's newest toys with him. With these and his other assets, von Arnim was able to expand his defensive position in Bizerte and Tunis into one larger defensive line. From this strengthened position, he was able to fend off Anderson's Christmas Eve offensive just as the infamous Tunisian downpours began. Operation Torch had ground to a halt as 1942 came to an end. The Germans and Italians would be able to defend their new perimeter in the new year, but that tactical victory came at a strategic cost. Tanks and men sent to Tunisia were desperately needed elsewhere, especially against the Soviets in the east. In early January, Rommel's retreating Africa Corps arrived in southeast Tunisia, still on the run from Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army. Knowing that he was seriously outnumbered and outmaneuvered by the two-pronged Allied advance, he would take advantage of his ability to move more quickly within a constrained space to attack multiple points in quick succession. Leaving a partial force at the old French Meurthe line, he decided to attack the Western First Army, first, aiming to drive them back through the narrow passes between the Atlas Mountains near Gafsa. The assault saw reasonable success. After a few probing attacks, the true assault came on February 14th, when the 21st Panzer Division attacked the U.S. 2nd Corps, destroying 100 American tanks near Sidi Bouzid. Rommel urged the division commander to continue the attack after his initial success, but he waited another day for authorization from von Arnim, who was technically in charge. They pushed the Americans back 50 miles to Kasserine Pass, where they put up a stubborn resistance that lasted for 5 days. Meanwhile, Rommel himself peeled off and captured an Allied airfield at Telepete on February 17th. Rommel hoped to then push north to Tebessa, an American logistical nexus, but Arnim was unwilling to commit to such an aggressive attack. Instead, on February 19th, he was ordered to attack northwest at Tala instead, just where Anderson was expecting. When the Axis finally punched through Kasserine on February 20th, Anderson was ready with reinforcements and ground attack aircraft that beat Rommel back 2 days later. Having lost the momentum of his final assault and facing renewed Allied strength, Rommel was on the verge of defeat in North Africa, and as it turned out, attacking the western prong first may have been a grave miscalculation. Montgomery's 8th Army had been strung out in its pursuit, and only one division faced the Meurthe line on February 26th. When Rommel attacked 10 days later, its strength had quadrupled. Having finally learned the utility of anti-tank guns in the field, the British chewed right through Rommel's forces and repelled his attack. It was around this time that the Desert Fox, allegedly dealing with serious illness, was recalled to Europe. It was an ignoble end to the famous general's campaign. Von Arnim was left in the unenviable position of picking up where Rommel had left off. On March 17th, George Patton's 2nd Corps tried to cut off the Africa Corps retreating along the coast to Tunis, but their attack was ultimately parried in the mountain passes. Nonetheless, the danger of such a development was established. 3 days later, the bulk of the 8th Army began a more direct assault on the Meurthe line, while the New Zealand Corps made a wide flanking maneuver and assaulted from the rear near Al Hama. The frontal assault ultimately failed to completely punch through the line, so Montgomery began shifting attention to the flank on March 23rd. Facing the prospect of encirclement, the Germans and Italians began quickly retreating. Their defense at Al-Hama lasted long enough for most of the Afrika Korps to escape before the Allies finally breached the line on March 28th. On April 11th, all Axis elements had joined together in the northeastern portion of Tunisia. You might think that the reasonable strategic decision at this point would be to pull your forces out of the theater to better defend Europe. You'd be right, but that's not what the Axis did. Instead, they demanded von Arnim defend a 100-mile perimeter around Bizerte and Tunis. By the end of April 1943, Axis defenses in the region were being strained to the limit. After steady Allied advances, a relative calm took hold for the next 2 weeks, except to the northwest, where Americans and a French North African Corps were able to reach within 20 miles of Bizerte. During this period, Anderson redeployed his forces in preparation for one final strike from the north, using dummy tanks and other decoys to trick von Arnim into assuming the attack would instead come from the south. Overnight on Wednesday, May 5th, the 4th Indian and 4th British Infantry Divisions broke through the German perimeter after an intensive aerial and artillery bombardment, clearing the way for the 6th and 7th Armored Divisions. Though the British forces had only advanced about 5 miles closer to the city, Axis defenders could no longer effectively maneuver in their defense. During the evening on Saturday, the British entered Tunis, while almost simultaneously, the Americans and French broke into Bizerte. The formal surrender of Axis forces in the area, resulting in as many as 250,000 prisoners, wouldn't come until the next week, finally bringing the war in that theater to an end. When all was said and done, the worst fears of the German High Command had been realized. In pursuit of Mussolini's new Roman Empire, they had overextended themselves while forces were desperately needed elsewhere. The North African campaign was a war of attrition, and after 3.5 years, it was clear that the logistical apparatus of the Allies had decisively outmatched its Axis counterpart. Rommel's strategic mind was undoubtedly gifted, but so were those of his adversaries. Many of the Allied leaders that had cornered the Desert Fox would serve in the Allied invasion of Sicily and the Normandy landings within the next 2 years. Stephen W. Sears writes this: "For some, North Africa was the first step on the road to military fame. Eisenhower became Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, with Montgomery the head of ground forces. But for others, the Desert War was the climax of their military careers. Wavell and Auchinleck later served in relative obscurity in the Far East. General Ritchie ended up as a corps commander in Europe under Montgomery. For Erwin Rommel, the future brought only disillusionment and doom. In July 1944, a group of generals tried to kill the Führer by planting a bomb in his headquarters. Rommel took no part in it. However, he did not know that the conspirators planned to name him head of state if they succeeded. But Hitler survived, and in the purge that followed, Rommel was implicated. They gave him the choice of suicide by poison or a public execution with its disgrace to his family and memory. If you want to avoid being implicated in a coup d'etat, you'll want to make sure you can build an online presence that doesn't suggest any subversive tendencies. You can use today's sponsor, Hover, to buy a domain name like totally not part of OperationValkyrie.com or one that fits any other project you're passionate about. Hover will help you get started on building a website for your brand, business, or anything else you think the world should hear about. What's more, with Hover, you can change website hosting platforms and still keep your domain name without any problem. Go to hover.com/armchairhistorian to sign up and you'll get 10% off of your first purchase. Before we wrap up, I'd like to let you guys know about the giveaway that Ironside Computers is doing. Click the link in the description below and enter into Ironside's summer giveaway, and you can potentially win a really powerful computer, the specs of which are listed on screen. The giveaway ends on June 30th, so enter fast. Ironside provided me with a really great desktop back in 2018 to run both graphically demanding games and CPU-intensive animation software like Adobe After Effects.